Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the to today's session. I'm Rich Jalen with LS Technologies. PK apologizes; he had another conflict and he was unable to be here, but did want to welcome everybody to this third and final session. This is the series for the Advanced Air Mobility Group, focused on airspace for the working group. For those others who are joining us, welcome as well. The first two sessions focused on en route and terminal operations with a mention of airspace. Today's session is focused on the airspace itself. This session is being recorded, just so that everyone knows that. Appreciate if everyone would keep their mics muted while you're in the session so that we don't get the feedback. Before we jump right in, I wanted to turn around and say, Chris, are you out there? Is there anything that you'd like to say before we get started?
Thank you, Rich. Yes, I'm here. I'm looking forward to learning more information today on the national airspace because you are always giving us new tidbits of information. This has been a really popular series, and thank you again for making this possible. And I'll turn it back over to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. No problem at all. I would ask that everybody, in addition to muting your mics, if you'll turn off your video cameras. For those folks who may be having bandwidth issues, we're trying to conserve bandwidth for them. Most people it doesn't, but some of the ones who are in areas with low bandwidth, it could be an issue. So if you turn that off, today's session, like I said, will be the final in this series. I'll be turning it over to Ian Fulmer, who will be walking you through today's focus on the airspace itself. As I said, the sessions are being recorded. At the end of this, Chris will tell you where they're going to post the video of the session if you're interested in going back and reviewing, and we will handle that on the end. The presentation itself will be about 45-50 minutes long, and then we'll have a question and answer period at the end. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Ian Fulmer. Ian, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Rich. Good morning or good afternoon, NASA, depending on which part of the country you're in. A very happy National Coffee Day to you. Today, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the structure of the National Airspace System from two different perspectives, briefly from the way it's organized via ATC facility, and then we'll delve into the different airspace types and classes. As Rich mentioned, my name is Ian Fulmer. I worked at Oakland Center for 26 and a half years. Been working about the last 3 as an air traffic subject matter expert on behalf of LS Technologies. Again, this is just an overview to give you a comprehensive perspective on airspace. Would be a matter of several hours, if not days. My aim is just hopefully to give you a nice high-level summary, and if I'm lucky, share a few nuggets with you that'll be helpful in your very important UAM and AAM work going forward. Now, how did we get here? How did we get to the present state of the National Airspace System? Well, to begin with, aviation was very much like the Wild Wild West, but developed rapidly along with commerce in the United States. We went from barnstorming biplanes to jets within the matter of 50 years. After World War II, traffic essentially doubled within the span of about 10 years. So it took a while for the system to catch up, and unfortunately, as so often happens, tragedy spurs action and progress. So with an unfortunate mid-air collision in the Grand Canyon in 1956 between a TWA and United aircraft that were, believe it or not, operating IFR, that spurred congressional action, which ultimately resulted in the FAA being broken off as a separate government agency chartered with aviation safety. And that paved the way for the present system of 20 air traffic control centers we had today, and much broader radar coverage throughout the continental United States. And then if you fast forward again about 30 years or so to the mid-'80s, aviation is booming as a result of the deregulation in the 1970s. And we had, at that point in time, as we still do today, a wide variety of GA aircraft and commercial jets in the mix with each other in the same airspace. And as a result of a couple of, again, unfortunate incidents in the mid-'80s where you had a general aviation aircraft kind of blunder into large passenger aircraft, tragedy resulted, further action was spurred at that time. And it was in the late 80s that we began to move towards the present ICAO classification system we have of letters A through G in the United States, which was an attempt, and I'd say it's a pretty successful attempt, to do a better job of segregating large airplanes from small airplanes in areas where there's a fair amount of congestion. Southern California being one of those areas where two of these notable incidents happened in the mid-80s, one of which was in Cerritos, California, near Orange County. Now, if you look at the bottom, or it's the image on the right, that's actually math from a flight school I trained at in the late 80s that shows what is essentially the precursor to the A through G system we have today. As that was getting spooled up, an attempt was made to begin to segregate aircraft a little bit better. So around the John Wayne Orange County Airport there, you see what is now today Class C airspace, but as that system was being spooled up, that was actually called an airport radar service area. So believe it or not, this was implemented in 1989, and prior to that, you could just, as I did as a student pilot, just go right offshore within about 6 miles of two major airports and practice your stalls or whatever. So this came about, and shortly thereafter, the airspace classification system that we'll be delving into a little bit later in this briefing. So first we'll look at the structure of the air traffic facilities within the United States. We won't spend too much time, especially on this view. This is a very high level view, like from space, essentially. You see that the FAA is tasked with managing a tremendous amount of airspace, and close to half or the majority of it is oceanic, which is out of scope for this briefing. That was a briefing I did about 6 weeks ago or so. So we're really only going to focus on the continental United States, but just again to give you a high level view, big oceanic operations in New York and Oakland. But onto our lettered airspace construct, and this again is just the overview. What we have today is a system of airspace A through G that admits aircraft on the basis of different requirements that we'll delve into a little bit. And then on the right, you see a video of typical journey of a commercial aircraft as it transits these different kind of airspaces en route to its destination. And the bottom, the cheese wheel, as I would call it, shows special activity airspace, which is, I'll say broadly, airspace that is set up to keep non-participating aircraft out because there's usually some hazardous activity contained within that special activity airspace. And that special activity airspace can overlay any of the other A through G classifications. And again, we'll delve into that a little bit here further into the briefing in detail. So this is just to kind of whet your appetite a little bit. So again, looking at the air traffic facilities in the United States, and you see the broad movement of aircraft. Pre-COVID, unfortunately, a little bit more quiet now, but it will come back. It always does. Wide variety of facilities. Again, beyond the scope of the briefing to drill down too much on them, but I will give you a broad overview of how these facilities are set up and organized in terms of the airspace. Now, the basic building block of the air traffic system in terms of facilities is the ARTC, the Air Route Traffic Control Center. There's 20 of them in the continental United States, and they really serve as the mothership to all the air traffic facilities underneath them. They ingest all the flight data and distribute it to the terminal facilities. They delegate the airspace that the terminal facilities are in charge of when they open. And you'll see that as you go out further west, they get a little bit larger in size. The sectors are a little bit bigger, and that's because the traffic volume is not quite as dense as it is on the East Coast. So on the East Coast, you tend to have Smaller centers, smaller sectors, and as you saw from the previous graphic with the airplanes moving about, a bit more congestion. The centers, they delegate airspace to the approach controls at low level, right? For any approach control, and in this example, you see Northern California TRACON, there's going to be a letter of agreement that specifically lays out which airspace the TRACON is responsible for. And beyond that, it will show the procedures that the TRACON and the center have agreed to in terms of managing traffic. But this is generally the first thing you're going to see in the letter of agreement is a stipulation that, hey, we're giving you this airspace, and then it will be defined in an addendum. On the right-hand side, you see the central polygon to Northern California TRACON, the thing that looks like, looks a little bit like the head of an Easter Island statue. That's the main polygon over the Bay Area. There's an additional polygon that Northern California TRACON is tasked with that is out by the Reno area, kind of an island unto itself. There's some Oakland Center airspace in between those two polygons. So in the same way that, here's the approach controls. Right, see, this graphic gives you a sense of the distribution of the approach controls in the United States. You'll note that on the East Coast, commensurate with the higher density of traffic, there are more approach controls. The East Coast centers tend to have their floors carpeted with approach controls. Out on the West Coast, not so much. So the bottom line there is controllers in the western part of the United States, center controllers tend to do a fair amount of approach work too. Minneapolis Center, Salt Lake Center, even in Oakland Center does a fair amount of approach control work, especially up in the Napa Valley area and north of there. But in the same way then that those centers delegate airspace to approach controls delegate airspace to the towers below them. And this is apparent in the publications that apply to terminal facilities. On the left, you have a NOTAM, and there's a graphic of the San Jose Airport, and on the right is an excerpt from the Airway Facilities Directory. But in both cases, you can see some language that stipulates the hours that the towers are open, the tower is open, and then what to do when the tower is closed if you want a clearance. The airspace classification will change, but the bottom line is when the tower is closed, and most towers are not 24-hour towers, the approach control wants its airspace back, and in the event that the tower can't function as well, the approach control is there to handle the traffic at the airport. As an example, in March of this year, the Las Vegas tower was closed for 1 week because a couple of employees tested positive for COVID-19. So as they cleared out the facility, believe it or not, L30, Las Vegas TRACON, ran that airport for about a week, and lucky for them, it was manageable because traffic was down at that time. But the airspace system does have that element of flexibility in it. So when one player is not available, somebody else fills in, and that's what approach controls do when towers are not open or have to be closed. So here we see the different classifications of airspace. This is a map of airspace, not a screenshot of my son playing Minecraft. In terms of remembering the different airspace classifications, you can use mnemonics. I like to think of Class A as being above everything else. Class B, C, and D, there's going to be controllers there because B, C, and D airspace is associated generally with a towered airport. E is the default. It's everywhere. It's everywhere unless there's a need for a different kind of airspace. It's everywhere below 18,000 feet median sea level. And then Class G is easy to remember because it's close to the ground level. And then, in case you're wondering, above flight level 600, we resume Class E airspace. Class E airspace is 600 to infinity. I know many of you are familiar with it. We call it upper E. There are a number of requirements associated with each type of airspace. We're just going to focus on the two that I think will be of the most interest to you. That's the level of communication with air traffic control and the equipment required. And then we'll also delve a little bit into special activity airspace once we get done with the various airspace classifications. So with that, onward briefly to Class A airspace. Another way to remember Class A airspace is to think it's for the alphas, it's for the big dogs. And it's almost beautiful in its simplicity. The rules tend to be a little bit simpler. It's IFR flight only, and that's very rigid. There's no VFR, there's no VFR on top, no visual separation is permitted. So you have to be IFR. Even UASs like the RQ-4, for example, the Global Hawk that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, essentially performs like any other IFR aircraft when it's in Class A airspace, or at least in my experience, behaves exactly like one. As a matter of trivia, if you're wondering why Class A airspace ends at flight level 600 and you resume Class E, military aircraft like to fly VFR on top at or above 600. Having Class E airspace are afforded the opportunity to do that. It gives them a little bit of an operational advantage. So with that, we'll move on to Class B, which I think will be of a little more interest to you. So, Class B airspace typically surrounds the busiest terminals in the United States. It's got that classic upside down wedding cake shape about it. In theory, it does anyway. Surface to 10,000 feet MSL. And the shape of the Class B airspace is generally somewhat gerrymandered to protect the instrument procedures to the airport and in accordance with the operational needs of the geographic and metropolitan area. Now, to get into Class B airspace, an ATC clearance is required, although with limited exception, there are some VFR flyways in a few places, Los Angeles being a notable example, where if you, as a VFR pilot, adhere very rigidly to a prescribed route, you do not need a clearance. But that, again, is very rare. Class B airspace, one of the few places where controllers will actively separate IFR and VFR traffic. Generally, VFR traffic is only afforded flight following by controllers, but Class B, for obvious reasons, because of the density and what's at play in Class B, controllers will separate that IFR and VFR traffic. There's a 200 knot speed limit below Class B airspace. And also, to continue with the wedding metaphor associated with Class B airspaces, what has always been called the Mode C veil, an equipment requirement within 30 miles of the primary airport and surface to 10,000 feet MSL. Now, it should be called the ADSB veil, but the Mode C veil moniker has kind of stuck. But again, 30 miles of primary airport outer below 10,000 feet MSL, you need to have ADSB. So here's an example of the San Francisco Class B airspace. You'll note that it actually looks nothing like a wedding cake. It looks more like, I don't know, maybe the Millennium Falcon. And you can see that there's some slots in there with Class C airspace for the Oakland and the San Jose airport. If you look in the graphic on the far left-hand side, and you see the purple arrows along the margins there, those are VFR flyways for VFR aircraft, but they are not of the exceptional kind I mentioned earlier, where you don't need a clearance. It states very clearly on the chart that the aircraft need a clearance. The shape, you'll notice, is cut short somewhat on the northwest side, and I believe that's because it roughly coincides with the center TRACON boundary. And policing entry into and out of Class B airspace and working Class B airspace generally, I think, is something that's probably more within the controller, the TRACON controller skill set. So that's probably why it's set up like that. And you notice how big the Mode C, the ADSB veil is. I actually live underneath the Mode C veil in San Francisco, And it goes all the way down to the surface. So you're not only cutting through Class B airspace, there's Class G, Class E, Class C. So now, does that mean if I'm going to fly my UAS out in my backyard so I can take some cool pictures of my solar panels, do I need to have a DSP? I don't know. Some questions you need to ask very carefully. With that, we'll go on to Class C airspace. So, Class C airspace is a little bit smaller in accordance with the airports it serves. Airports tend to have still be pretty busy, but have a little bit less traffic than a major hub like a Class B. You'll have an inner core of 5 miles, and that inner core will extend up more or less to 4,000 feet above ground level. Then there's a bit of a top hat there to the Class C airspace, out to 10-mile radius, 1,200 feet AGL to 4,000 feet AGL. The operating requirement of note is don't need a clearance, you need to establish two-way radio communications. Now, in researching this project, I noted that in a number of instructional videos, a lot of flight instructors like to really showcase the fact that you don't need a clearance. You just more or less need to get the controller's attention, and you're golden, or so they say. So really like to feature this. It's a practice. If you're a pilot, I would exercise caution with, because the way it was presented, it was like a freedom fighter in the name of general aviation trying to put one over on the man. That's not a good way to look at it. I can tell you as a controller, if you get my attention and I'm busy and I don't get back to you in a timely fashion, probably a good practice to give me a little reminder. So in looking at the airspace, then you'll see, again, similar to the Class B airspace, it is not purely representative of the notional Class C, but again, it's been somewhat tailored to the surrounding airports. You'll note in the upper left-hand corner, there's some Class D airspace for Los Alamitos Airport, and then to the right, you can see where what used to be Class E airspace for that El Toro Airport that's now closed is not there anymore. So you got kind of a bite taken out of the Class C airspace, and you'll see it also roughly parallels the runways at the Orange County Airport. So with that, we'll move briefly on to the Class D airspace. Class D airspace generally serves the towered airports with the least amount of traffic, and commensurate with that, the structure is a little bit reduced in scale, more or less surface to 2,500 feet above ground level. Quite often, the airspace will be tailored to the instrument procedures, just like with the Class C or Class B airspace. In the example on the right-hand side, you'll see Brown Airport in San Diego, which has pretty close to a circle because there are no published instrument procedures for that airport. And then conversely, out to the west is Naval Air Station Imperial Beach, and it has that keyhole structure to the Class D airspace to support, I believe it's a runway 27 or runway 28 TACAN for the airport. And Brown Airport, it's got that circle, but again, tailored to the metropolitan area. You'll note that the keyhole abruptly chops off right there at the international border, and just across the border is at Tijuana Airport in Mexico. So similar to Class C airspace, have to talk to the controller before you can get into the airspace, but you don't need a clearance. On to Class E. As you can see from the graphic, Class E is more or less everywhere. The holes where the B, C, and D airspace shows you that the system really is set up to afford the maximum amount of possible freedom to aviators, which I think is a good thing. We're only going to impose Class B, C, and D where it's necessary. In most cases, the Class E airspace begins at 1,200 feet above ground level, goes up to 17,999 feet mean sea level. Where necessary, however, Class E airspace will go down to 700 feet above ground level, or in some cases, down to the ground. And you see an example of that in the graphic in the bottom right-hand corner of a thermal airport in the Coachella Valley in California. And that broken purple circle indicates that the Class E airspace, controlled airspace, extends down to the surface to help facilitate the instrument procedures at that airport. Although it is an untowered airport, it's kind of an offload airport for executive aircraft going to Palm Springs or destined for the Coachella Valley region, which is popular. So having that controlled airspace all the way down to the surface helps the controllers at Southern California TRACON that are working that airspace assist those pilots. And as a matter of trivia, and to note, interesting, at minus 114 feet below sea level, one of the lowest lying airports in the United States. Now, if you'll note in that graphic also a magenta line, that magenta line demarcates the boundary between the Class E airspace that goes down to 700 feet above ground level and 1,200 feet of ground level, above ground level. Now, the soft side of that line, anything inside there, the controlled airspace goes down to 700 feet above ground level. And this is very common in large metropolitan areas where you have a group of airports, as you do in the Coachella Valley, with a fair amount of air traffic. And then the crisp side of the line, as you get away from the busy area, then you're back up to the default where the Class E starts at 1,200 feet AGL. The operating requirements in terms of, again, very loose. Don't need ADS-B unless you're in that ADS-B veil. Communications, no communications requirement. So if you're a VFR pilot, you're free to just kind of tool around as long as you're staying out of that BC and D airspace. And then finally, before we move on to the G airspace, the uncontrolled airspace, one question that our airspace classification system begets is, well, what about Class F airspace? The Class F airspace classification does exist within the ICAO scheme. However, we elected not to use it in the United States. I'm not sure exactly why that is. Perhaps some of you know, but my theory is that one of the stipulations of Class F airspace is that separation services is provided to IFR aircraft when able. So I think that probably that level of ambiguity is something we're not comfortable with here. Here we like to separate IFR aircraft, so we don't use that. Finally, Class G, again, close to the ground, uncontrolled airspace. It's anything that hasn't been designated as Class A, B, C, D, or E. Usually, surface, almost overwhelmingly, like 99% of the time, it's going to be from surface to 1,200 feet above ground level, or surface to 700 feet above ground level. There's some other geometries out there, but they're exceedingly rare. For a long time, off the coast of Baja California, from about 120 west to about 200 miles offshore, there was a area of uncontrolled airspace that was literally thousands of miles in volume. I believe within the last couple of years, that's been reclassified as Class A airspace, which is probably a good thing because, as I remember it, that volume of airspace got a fair amount of traffic. In the graphic here, you'll see the magenta line that, in the same way it demarcates the different volumes of Class E airspace, the mirror image of that is Class G airspace. So within the soft side of the magenta line, that means the Class G airspace, uncontrolled airspace, only goes up to 700 feet. So that New Jerusalem airport would be similar to the airport, the pink airport on the far left-hand side. And then within the crisp side, you're back to the default where the uncontrolled airspace only goes up, or excuse me, goes all the way up to 1,200 feet above ground level. So that airport in the far left-hand side of the graphic would be like the single runway in the pink graphic in the pink block of Class G airspace. So uncontrolled doesn't mean that there's no rules whatsoever, that it's completely unregulated. VFR pilots are still required to comply with minimum flight visibility and distance from cloud requirements. Likewise, IFR pilots are required to maintain obstacle clearance and proper altitude for direction of flight. Next, we'll move on to our special activity. Oh, I'm sorry. We'll briefly touch on ADSB and the relationship ADSB has to the various airspace types, which we touched on already, and just a real brief discussion of ADSB coverage. So you'll note that ADSB airspace or ADSB requirements apply in a variety of airspace space classifications, especially within that Mode C veil. Again, to reiterate, you could have any kind of airspace within that veil, although the bulk of it is going to be Class B. And that graphic, by the way, is a little bit misleading because it almost makes it look like the Class B airspace. There's a gap between the top of the Class B airspace and the top of the Mode C veil. Generally, they're both at 10,000 feet median sea level. And then Class C airspace, interestingly, there is airspace above that where ADSB is required. There's a bit of a top hat, if you recall. The Class C airspace only goes up to 4,000 feet above ground level. But again, you can see there's a fair amount of freedom below 10,000 feet median sea level where the ADSB is not required. In looking at the coverage of ADSB, this is the coverage that was mapped out when ADSB was implemented at Oakland Center about 6 years ago, I believe. And the thing to note of interest in my mind, at 1,800 feet above ground level, the orange area indicates areas where coverage was picked up that did not exist with pure radar. Fairly significant. And although I know there are provisions within some of the proposals for UAM AAM corridors not to have ADSB on, nonetheless, I think the fact that it is available at this low of an altitude may be of interest, maybe something that can be leveraged going forward, especially when you consider that within those orange areas where ADSB coverage has picked up previous areas of non-coverage in the Central Valley and in the Carson Valley around Reno, I believe there are a fair number of logistics hubs that may one day be served by UASs or the AM or UAM scheme. We'll move on to the next slide then. Another thing that pilots have to consider, and controllers as well, are the various minimum altitudes that they're required to abide by. I won't go in detail on any of them except to say that the top four are really the ones that pilots focus on, and the bottom three are the ones that are of the most concern to controllers, especially the MSA, the minimum safe altitude. If an aircraft nears that minimum safe altitude or gets below it, it will fire a warning on the controller's display, and the controller will definitely call out to the pilot and be very concerned at that point. On the next graphic, on the next slide, we'll see a brief example of the minimum en route altitude. This is for a departure out of the Honolulu airport, and you'll note the minimum en route altitude there of 4,000 on that radial will ensure that the pilot is able to receive the appropriate radial from the Lanai VOR in order to navigate the departure as well as clear any obstacles there. And now I think we move on to the special activity airspace. There we go. So again, we look at our cheese wheel, two subcategories of special activity airspace. There's the special use airspace, and then there's all the others. We won't really delve into special use airspace too much here, except to say that They are generally more rigid, less apt to surprise you because they are usually permanently charted. As you see in that bottom graphic from the central coast of California, you see military operations areas, a restricted area, and on that VFR chart that I took those from, you would also find publicized hours of operation. So generally, you're going to know when there's some activity there and when to stay clear. And in my experience, the published hours are very conservatively uh, structured in that airspace tends to get used a lot less than claimed. So not likely to surprise you. Um, the kind of airspace that is likely to surprise you is airspace I would call more transitory in nature, like temporary flight restrictions, which we'll touch on briefly, and military training routes. In this graphic in the upper left-hand corner, um, you'll see a red outline, and that's actually an overlay of a temporary flight restriction that I believe is a firefighting TFR. We'll have a better example of that here shortly. I think it may even be on the next slide. Right, so temporary flight restrictions are, as the name implies, impermanent. They're there usually for events that may only take a day or a week, or in some cases, unfortunately, with the firefighting we have in Northern California, a month or more. Can be for, as you see here, firefighting, any number of things. Another common temporary flight restriction is for a VIP presence. Say somebody on the campaign trail flies into town for a fundraiser. You may have what's called a combat air patrol above the location of the fundraiser with a tanker and a few fighters in a cylinder of airspace that controllers and other aircraft need to circumvent. Large sporting events commonly will have a TFR over them. Don't want anybody running into the Goodyear blimp during the Super Bowl. The example you see here is for a firefighting TFR, or unfortunately one of the many we have right now in Northern California. This is north of the Mendocino area on close to Fort Bragg, just off of the coast, as you can see. And the thing to note is that the scale of the thing is massive. It looks to be, glancing at the map, about 60 minutes of latitude, one degree of latitude, which is it's about a 60 by 60 mile swath. I highlighted there in red that it goes all the way up to 12,000 feet. And again, unfortunately, it's in effect until the looks like the 17th of November. These are published by NOTAM, so there is some notice given to other users of the National Airspace System. However, they can crop up at a moment's notice. So just something to be aware of in the low altitude realm. The other piece I briefly wanted to touch on are the military training routes. There we go. Military training routes are of an IR, IFR variety, or a VFR variety. And unlike the TFRs, you may not receive very much in the way of advance notice when they're used. And they can be hazardous to non-participating aircraft for that reason, because you may not have much of a way in the heads up. And particularly because it can be very difficult, if impossible, for air traffic controllers to see, because they do operate very low to the ground in the case of VR routes, below 1,500 feet AGL. And you also note that the 250 knot speed limit does not apply. And you'll see a picture in the top left-hand corner, and believe it or not, that was excerpted from the Top Gun Maverick trailer. And when I saw the trailer and I saw this particular scene, I was somewhat noticeably, sorry? When I saw it, it came to mind that a lot of what we see in Top Gun is pure fantasy. The tower flyby, the international relations scene where they're inverted taking a Polaroid. But then I looked into it a little bit, and one of the many of the millions of amazing things you can see on YouTube is you can actually see cockpit footage of aircraft flying these VR routes. And the vista I was given was very similar to the one you see in the picture before you. I believe it was in Northern California where this F-18 was operating, and it's flying right through a river valley just like that, saw the pine trees and everything. So in looking at the map and looking at that center graphic there of VR202, that's in Northern California, and there are many VR routes like that, and you'll note that it does indeed go right through a river valley. It's in a mountainous area. So this is for real, and from my perspective as a controller, I've cleared aircraft down, F-18s down to flight level 180 and below, where they would go ahead and cancel IFR with the controller that you're being handed off to, and at that point, they'll rocket down to that VR route and essentially vanish. And at that point, they're just booking. And if you're lucky, they'll give you an estimate of when they're going to reemerge. If not, they'll just call. So something to be aware of. The IR routes are similar, IFR routes. The aircraft remain on an IFR clearance. However, they will attempt to maintain radio communications, which is not always possible. And they'll give the controller an estimate of when they think they're going to reemerge from the IR routes. But other than that, other than having a general idea of when the aircraft is going to reemerge and kind of which route he's on, they can be very difficult to see and understandably can present a hazard to any non-participating aircraft. Next slide, please. So in closing, I'd like to point out that airspace is seen many different ways depending on your perspective, just like anything else. So with system participants, the interesting thing to note here is if you were to base the knowledge required to operate as a VFR pilot, IFR pilot, or controller solely on what you see before you, would seem that the VFR pilot has a lot more to think about, a lot more to consider. And in some ways, that's true. If you look at the map, you see the different airspace classifications, the terrain is shown, none of which you see on an IFR map or a controller map. And for an IFR pilot, first of all, as part of the IFR ATC system, you are essentially shepherded amongst airspace classes by the controller. You're past the velvet rope at that point. There's no need to worry. The controller is going to take care of you, get you into the Class C, the Class B airspace. That's a controller's job. Similarly, you do see the minimum altitudes I discussed before, but as long as a pilot is compliant with the minimum altitudes stipulated on the route segments, there's nothing to worry about. And additionally, the controller is going to help out. As I mentioned, if the controller detects that there's an issue with the altitude that an aircraft is at, IFR pilot or a VFR pilot for that matter is talking to the controller is going to help that pilot out. And then finally, when you look at the controller's display, even more minimalist. And that's because not that the controller doesn't have to worry about all the things that the pilot does, but the controller, that's a controller's airspace. They know that airspace like the back of their hand. They're going to have all those details memorized before they're even allowed to plug in at the sector. So it's really only things that are of primary importance that are going to be on that map. The sector boundaries, and you know, this particular example, we see the minimum IFR altitudes are displayed, which are selectable, along with the minimum vectoring altitudes, both of which are very important to a controller. So a lot of things to consider for everyone in the system in terms of who's operating at low altitude, the airspace types, the different players, but the system has evolved to a point where we've been able to make it work. So the question I would leave you with is, where does the UAM AAM scheme fit in? Because in my mind, I'm certainly not Nostradamus, but it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when you become integrated in the system. And I commend you for being forward enough in your thinking to begin exploring these very important issues. So in this graphic, you see kind of a summary of some of the things we've talked about, some of the stuff that you may need to consider and contend with as you move forward. But again, I applaud you for your very important work, and I wish you the best of luck with it. I hope you got something out of this briefing and it's been helpful in that regard. I thank you for your time, and with that, we got a little bit of time for questions, so I'm going to turn it back over to Rich. Thanks.
Thanks, Ian. Before we go into the questions, we wanted to wrap up across the 3 sessions, and basically we hope it provided information for you to inform your discussions going forward, particularly for those who are on the Advanced Air Mobility Airspace Working Group. The objective was to make you aware. Some of you already were, so I mean that was clear, but it was also to hope that for those who may not be intimately familiar with, you're looking at a map and you think, well, there can't be a lot of stuff out there. The objective of this was that there is a lot of complexity in there. There are a lot of users. There's a lot of activity that's underway. I know we were harping on TFRs and MTRs, but for where you're going to operate, the intent was to make sure that as you have these discussions, to Ian's point about you're looking forward, and that's great. NAS is very complex. It's complex today. And introducing some new set of operations safely, considering new form factors, types of operations, there's going to be a challenge. I mean, there's no question about it. However, that's all NAS has. NAS continuously has evolved. It always evolves. As Ian mentioned earlier, it started from the barnstormers, and you moved your way up, and the system adapted to the breadth of the types of aircraft that we have now. Everyone just needs to come together on what we want the future to look like. You've got airspace, you've got all these users. What do you want it to look like? What is the vision that we're going to have for what we want? Now, for advanced air mobility, are you going to turn and have something like this? Now, granted, the airspace will go up higher, but for people who are operating there, that is the question that starts to be in everyone's mind. When you go into the discussions about what you want AAM and what the airspace is and what the considerations, there was a lot of discussion at the last meeting about corridors. Yes, half the people were for them, half the people were against them. If you don't have corridors, then all of this complexity and all of these other actors are going to be on that individual operator in order to comply with all of these requirements, because that's the way the system was there. One of the constructs behind creating corridors was that, okay, if there is another volume, then a lot of that complexity can be accounted for. That was kind of the rationale behind it. So that's the end of it. We hope that that for all of you that you got something useful out of it. And with that, I will open it up, and you're all free to ask whatever questions you might like in order to stump Ian. I encourage it. So please, with that, we'll open it up. Oh, no raised hands or anything? Excellent. Ah, okay.
Well,
Felipe.
not so fast.
Yeah, I was going to say, okay. And this was everybody was looking for where their little hand function was. Okay. Felipe, you get to go first. Felipe, you're going to have to unmute yourself. Maybe not. I'll tell you what, Felipe, we'll get back to you. Matt Scacero, if you can unmute yourself.
Close enough. I'll answer to anything with lots of S's. Hey, and nice job. Matt Scasro here from University of Maryland. Question you mentioned there at the very end about looking forward to the future and how we envision things. And I'm not trying to put you or the organization on the spot, but looking at the FAA's role in this, obviously has a significant role in this going forward. Do you see the FAA as being a person or an organization to catch the actions of what people are trying to do? Do you see them more as a leader of trying to incorporate UAM, AAM? Kind of what's your personal / organizational view on the FAA's role in moving UAM and AAM forward? Thank you.
So I would offer that the FAA has a dual role from the in the sense that it's both the regulator and it's also by statute the promotion of aviation. So it has both roles. And in the case of this, it is partnered with NASA. That's why the Airspace Working Group, the items that come out of there, will be taken into account. As for whether it's leading, the FAA has put the first, its UAM ConOps was on the street a couple months ago. So I would offer that it appears to me that it has a dual role. It's regulatory. It is trying to lead. It is put information out there, but it's also seeking input and the collaboration with the community through these NASA venues. I hope that answers it. Felipe, you want to take another shot at it, man?
Yeah, thank you very much, Felipe Baron here from Baron Vehicles. Thank you very much, Ian, for the presentation. Very, very interesting. When you look at the classes, they seem to make a lot of sense when you make a vertical cut of airspace. But as we move into urban air mobility, um, there's apparent changes to that when you make horizontal cuts to the airspace over the cities and suburbs, because you have no-fly zones. You have, of course, these airports and their airspace classes and so on. So there seems to be a need to create a new class of airspace for urban air mobility when cutting horizontally over the cities. Does that fit anything in your mind in terms of the need to create a class for urban air mobility? Thank you very much.
I'll defer, Ian. You can take your shot first. How's that?
Okay, thanks, Rich. Yeah, that's a great question. In my mind, like anyone else, for better or worse, I tend to frame what the future is going to look like in terms of what I've seen in the past and what's worked. And honestly, not being an expert in terminal operations, but I can read a aviation map, and you'll note that if you look at some of those terminal charts we had before early in the briefing, like in the Class B airspace, you do see a number of helicopter corridors, VFR corridors. So a precedent does exist for that. Perhaps, and I know this has already been explored, there'll be a similar, some type of UAM corridor that works. And those VFR corridors, like the one I mentioned over Los Angeles, that's been there forever. So apparently it works. And the key, to tie back to the first question, in terms of garnering the participation of the agency and the people that work for the agency, in my experience, things always work the best when you bring in the players right at the ground level, right from the get-go, like the controllers that know that terminal airspace, because they would be able to give you the best idea of what areas will work, where you can kind of thread the needle, and where you can, and come up with something that's workable. So I think what you suggest is workable, and I find it actually encouraging that we do have a precedent for that.
Thanks, Ian. Mike DiCasola.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, excellent presentation. Thank you both very much for all the effort, and it's greatly appreciated. So I have an interest in the lower level that I would like to just spin off from the prior person's questions. I also believe that it would be really interesting to see how we would be able to make a separate class at 400 AGL or lower for the UAS, because I could see where we can actually make a subclass, and I'd like to know your viewpoints on that, because it may be that a UAS is too large, or too much payload, or the type of payload that it's actually delivering might be a restrictive type of payload that needs to be safer to the public underneath because it's so low level. The size of the payload, all of these different variables that would make the corridor for the UAS and UAV be able to accommodate a subcategory. So if it was a class, would it be like, okay, very lightweight products or services that are not security intense or highly hazardous, those will be at 100 AGL and so forth, So what's your thoughts on that?
So for me, I would offer that I think that's what that's how we kind of got to the corridors discussion. Essentially, corridors become a subclass kind of arrangement, but with a distinction. The classes, as Ian went through, I mean, you saw that they're pretty standard. I mean, they're highly structured in terms of what the requirements are for each one. Quarters, and I'm offering that because there's been the discussion. It's not that I'm saying that hey, everybody needs to get on board and get quarters. I mean, I'm just offering that some of the discussions that have gone on said that each of the corridors can take on a different flavor in terms of they're not bound by international agreements and things like that. You can have specific performance requirements. You can have specific operational requirements, things that essentially, I believe, Mike, that you were trying to go to. I get a little nervous when we say a subclass or create a new class of airspace. The breadth of types of operations and the vehicles themselves, their size, their weight, are they carrying passengers or not? Are they carrying what kind of cargo and how much? It starts to become very difficult in a structured class system to deal with that. But if you are able to create something that is more flexible and automation centric, which is kind of what the corridors are discussed and envisioned as articulated in the UAM ConOps that the agency published, and in some of the items that NASA has done, I think you kind of get to where you are. You just don't call it the same thing. So I hope that helps.
No, it does, because I mean that's really just the interest is finding out how we would make the flexibility work with yet still making those corridors that you're using as an example possible.
Yeah.
But
Thank you. David Abera.
Good day, everyone. How's everybody doing?
Okay, and yourself?
Good. Funny you guys are talking about UAM and the corridors. For flight standards, I'm the UAS representative for UAM at AFS 300. We're actually, regarding the question on having not so much also the corridors, but the levels where the UAM aircraft are going to be flying. NASA, FAA, and also industry, we're currently looking at that, where would be most advantageous for them. So in fact, I can't say what month, but very, very soon that we're going to be testing out the takeoff and approach procedures on how to approach vertical airports, both landing and takeoff, and then also with the flight levels. So we're looking at that currently.
Well, thank you very much. Chris Casera, you have the last question.
Oh, great, thanks. My name's Chris. I'm from One Sky. So we're involved in software, and my interest is in navigation, surveillance, coverage, and performance. And you talked about the volumes of airspace like B, C, D, A, E, and then there was a chart on ADS-B and radar performance that you talked about too. I think my question is, within the airspace like B and C, where you call it controlled and there's ATC control, is ATC guaranteed to have coverage for radar and ADS-B in those areas? Can you see the entire volume in a controlled airspace like B and C?
No.
Ian, I'll defer to you.
Yeah, thanks. I'm certainly not an expert on ADS-B coverage, so there would be an element of speculation to my answer, but I think there is a limit to any surveillance coverage. Clearly, the closer you get to the ground, the less you're going to see. And again, it's a little bit of speculating here on my part, but I think that's probably in some measure why controlled airspace doesn't start at the ground, except for close to an airport, where quite often you will have a radar right at the airport, or in many cases now an ADS-B receiver. So like anything else, and I would point back to the graphic too of the ADS-B coverage at 1,800 feet. You may notice that, especially there in the Carson Valley, there was a fair amount of coverage at 1,800 feet AGL, but in some cases there was none. So again, been my experience, and the agency has a lot of experts on surveillance, of which I'm not one, but I know a little bit about it. Your coverage is for obvious reasons going to be much better close to airports, and then once you get out into rural areas, not so much.
Thanks, Ian. I will offer this. One of the last activities I had before I left the agency was around air traffic requirements. And what you see, and the reason for the coverage, it's not everywhere, and it goes to the ground where it needs to go to the ground. And there are places where you have blind spots on the other side of mountains, which ADS-B tends to fill in. But what you see is surveillance coverage that is in response to where traffic is. Now, that's based on the traffic that is there now. Introducing new form factors, introducing new types of operations and different altitudes is going to change what the surveillance and requirements and all are. But again, This is going to be dependent on, are the AAM vehicles going to be operating in the classic structure? Or are they going to be operating in separate corridors? Are they going to be operating, so it's not possible to really answer those questions except for the way you posed it about Class B and Class C. No, there's not 100% coverage in every Class B and Class C everywhere, but there is sufficient coverage to handle the operations that are currently conducted within those volumes, because over the years, they've all been kind of fine-tuned in order to do that, or they have procedures and practices that account for it. Because as Ian had mentioned, you can have airports where you have an IFR procedure that runs into there, and then when the guy shoots the procedure, he gets on the ground and he calls you and tells you that he was there. He's separated from all the other IFR aircraft. So no, the coverage is not everywhere, but the current system has essentially evolved for that which is most cost effective for the surveillance necessary. It remains to be seen what's necessary for the future. So as you talk about the airspace in your AAM working group, and okay, where are the operations going to be? How often are they going to be? What are the rules they're going to operate under within that airspace? That's where those are going to be fleshed out. So with that, I'd like to draw to a close and thank everyone for showing up. Sorry, Peter, but I would offer Chris, if you'd like to take us home for the final word and I'd like to thank our NASA host for doing that.
Thank you, Rich and Ian, for your time, for adapting this information for the working groups. We really appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for joining this series. We hope you found it useful. And if you missed the first two sessions, both slides and recordings are posted on the NARI website, where we post all of the past information and upcoming meetings. You just have to scroll all the way to the bottom. And this recording will be there as soon as possible. So thank you again, everybody.
Thank you, and everybody have a nice afternoon.